For nearly half a century, one woman carried a secret world within her. She had lived inside Graceland longer than most, serving as Elvis Presley's maid and seeing the king of rock and roll in ways no fan, no journalist, no friend could ever fully understand. To the public, Elvis was an untouchable icon, dazzling on stage, wrapped in wealth and fame, larger than life. But behind the iron gates of Graceland, he was someone else entirely. She saw him restless, troubled, kind, generous, lonely, and weighed down by pressures no applause could silence. Out of respect, fear, and grief, she said nothing for decades. But 45 years after Elvis's death, she began to speak. And what she revealed changed everything. When she first arrived at Graceland, she expected glamour, sparkle, and the glitz of stardom. What she found instead was a fortress, grand on the outside, heavy on the inside. Elvis had purchased the mansion in 1957 at the height of his fame, and by the time she began her work there, the estate had grown into something like a museum of his life. Velvet drapes hung across long hallways, ornate furniture filled the rooms, and every corner seemed to carry a lingering scent of cologne, leather, and smoke. Yet beneath the luxury, the house felt weighed down, as though the walls themselves carried secrets. Her work was endless. She dusted antiques, polished mirrors, folded the clothes Elvis wore, and tidied up after long nights of music and laughter. But nothing about Graceland resembled ordinary housekeeping. The atmosphere could shift in a heartbeat. Some nights the mansion echoed with voices, friends, cousins, bodyguards, what Elvis fondly called the Memphis Mafia. They filled the rooms with noise, laughter, and the clatter of glasses at all hours of the night. Other times, silence pressed down like a tomb. Elvis would pace the floors upstairs while the rest of the house seemed frozen, listening to the soft rhythm of his footsteps. She learned quickly that privacy was sacred. No one entered the upstairs suite without being called. Even staff approached cautiously if summoned. Still, there were glimpses, a shadow passing behind a door, the faint sound of his voice humming a hymn when he thought no one was listening. It was in those moments she realized Elvis wasn't simply the king adored by millions. He was a man alone in his own home, battling the quiet. Yet Graceland wasn't without joy. On certain nights, Elvis would sit at the piano and call everyone into the music room. He would sing gospel until dawn, his voice raw and unfiltered, echoing like a prayer. For the maid, those were the moments that reminded her of who he truly was. Not the rhinestone-clad performer on stage, but a man who felt most at home in music, surrounded by those he trusted. Even then, she sensed the contradiction. Graceland was both sanctuary and prison. Behind its gates, Elvis escaped the screaming fans outside, but inside, he built walls of his own. The maid saw another side of Elvis that most only heard in rumors, his extraordinary generosity. He gave endlessly, as though money and possessions were only temporary things to be passed along. He handed out Cadillacs like gifts, slipped cash into the hands of people who looked like they needed help, and paid hospital bills for strangers he never met. One evening, he gathered the entire staff and surprised each of them with a gift: fur coats, jewelry, watches, insisting they accept them as tokens of gratitude. His joy was never greater than when he was giving something away. But generosity came at a cost. She noticed how people came to expect it, how friends, employees, and even family began hovering not just for his company, but for what he could provide. Elvis seemed to know it, but could not stop himself. He would laugh as he handed out $100 bills, only to later retreat to his room, heavy with the knowledge that all his giving never filled the emptiness inside him. She accepted gifts herself and knew they weren't about material wealth. They were Elvis's way of connecting, of expressing love, of pushing back against the loneliness that haunted him even when he was surrounded by people. His kindness was his greatest strength, but also his weakness. She also saw the reality of Elvis's love life. Not the tabloids, not the rumors, but the truth. She witnessed the late-night visits, the hurried footsteps of women leaving at dawn, the whispered phone calls. Elvis was magnetic, and women seemed to orbit around him without resistance. Actresses, singers, admirers, whoever caught his eye might find themselves inside Graceland. But she noticed a pattern. Elvis never liked to be alone at night. He filled the hours with company, parties, music, sometimes inviting groups of people back after a show. The house would come alive with laughter, music, and chatter. But beneath the noise, she saw a man afraid of silence. Cleaning up afterward, she found the lipstick-stained glasses, overflowing ashtrays, and the faint perfumes that lingered long after the women were gone. To the outside world, it may have looked like decadence. To her, it looked like loneliness in disguise. His romances were intense but fleeting, filled with passion but often ending quickly. Elvis craved connection, yet seemed unable to sustain it. He could be tender and giving one moment, distant and withdrawn the next. Women adored him, but few truly understood him. Then there was his health. Over the years, she watched his body falter under the strain of his lifestyle. The evidence was everywhere. Pill bottles scattered on nightstands, prescription slips tucked into drawers, drinks left half-finished to ease pain. His grueling tours, sleepless nights, and poor habits took a toll. He often came home drenched in sweat, pale and exhausted. Sometimes he collapsed into a chair, silent, barely able to move. Other times he retreated upstairs and shut the door, leaving the staff to guess at his condition. The mood in Graceland was unpredictable. Bursts of joy and music would be followed by days of darkness where Elvis seemed unreachable. His once sharp wit grew dulled at times. His movements slowed. His moods swung between laughter and silence. Pills were everywhere, an open secret no one dared to confront. She remembered hearing him pacing at night, muttering prayers or half-singing to himself. These were moments when she understood Elvis not as a legend, but as a man losing a battle with his own body and mind. Graceland also held family tensions no one on the outside could imagine. His marriage to Priscilla brought both love and conflict. Even after their divorce, arguments echoed through the mansion, sometimes quiet, sometimes impossible to ignore. Yet, there was always tenderness for Lisa Marie. The maid remembered Elvis on the floor, laughing as his daughter climbed on his back, or reading to her for hours like any ordinary father. But even those moments carried shadows. He worried about being a good example, knowing that his own struggles sometimes made him fall short. Beyond his immediate family were the Memphis Mafia, the circle of friends who doubled as bodyguards and companions. They were loyal but also dependent, blurring the lines between friendship and self-interest. The maid heard their whispers, their rivalries, their enabling. She knew Elvis relied on them, but also sensed that their presence sometimes fueled his worst habits. And then there were the relatives, cousins, family members, hangers-on, who treated Graceland like their own. Elvis supported them all, but the pressure was constant. She recalled nights when he would slam his door, pacing in frustration, muttering that everyone wanted something from him. By the summer of 1977, she sensed the end approaching. Elvis was fading before her eyes. His once boundless energy was gone, his face puffier, his movements stiffer, his speech sometimes slurred. He leaned heavily on others for even simple tasks. He still rehearsed, still planned, still joked and smiled, but the light in his eyes flickered. He stayed upstairs more often, wandering at night, singing soft hymns that carried down the halls like ghosts. The staff whispered among themselves, afraid to say aloud what they all knew, that he was slipping away. On August 16, 1977, the silence inside Graceland was suffocating. The maid remembered the uneasy stillness that morning, as if the house itself knew something terrible was coming. Elvis had been restless the night before, moving between his room and the bathroom, reading, talking softly to himself. By late morning, the whispers began. Something was wrong. Panic spread through the mansion. She heard the frantic voices, the rush of footsteps, the desperate phone calls. Elvis had been found collapsed in the bathroom. She did not see him immediately, but she saw the faces of those who did, ashen, horrified, disbelieving. Chaos erupted. Sirens wailed outside. Paramedics rushed in, pushing past staff and family. The king of rock and roll was carried out on a stretcher, lifeless. The world outside the gates erupted with grief and disbelief as news spread. Inside, there was only shock, suffocating grief, and silence so heavy it seemed to crush the air. She remembered a cold cup of coffee in the kitchen, an untouched breakfast, telephones ringing endlessly, and the faces of those around her streaked with tears. For her, that morning marked a line between before and after. Elvis was gone. The man she had served, watched, and cared for, the man she had seen laugh and cry and struggle in ways the world would never know, was suddenly just a memory. Decades later, she could still hear the sirens, still feel the silence, still remember the shattering truth that Elvis Presley, larger than life, was gone forever. For decades, she said nothing. She carried her memories like a locked chest. She never wrote tell-all books, never sought interviews, never traded loyalty for attention. But as time passed, and the myths of Elvis grew larger than the man himself, she began to feel responsibility, not to scandalize or exploit, but to tell the truth about who he was. When she finally opened up, what she revealed was not gossip. It was humanity. She spoke of his laughter, the way it could light up a room. She spoke of his tenderness, the way he knelt to tie his daughter's shoes or read her bedtime stories. She spoke of his generosity, the countless lives he touched without headlines or applause. And she spoke of his struggles, his pills, his loneliness, his unshakable burden of being Elvis Presley. For her, Elvis was never just the king of rock and roll. He was a man of contradictions, filled with joy and sadness, generosity and despair. A man who gave everything he had to the world, only to find that the world never let him rest. And as she finally broke her silence, she wanted the world to know the truth. Behind the fame, behind the gates, behind the legend, there was a man searching for peace.